Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see you. So I recorded all of these comments around the discussion board, and I received the recording today, and it was completely silent. It was just my mouth moving. And so I don't know what happened. We're going to try this again. I'm going to try and, reinvent the magic that was there before, but we will see. So I'm going to dive in here. I wanted to start with the presentation from Myra, Letty, and Sylvia and say first, thank you for an excellent presentation. It was very well laid out. I really appreciated the discussion questions. They do make us think. A couple of things that really stick out to me as it relates to special education teacher attrition and retention is I was very surprised the first time that I looked at this lit review around how little research is actually done in this space. In some ways, it feels like it was almost an afterthought in many ways. So when you think about differentiation as it relates to subject, as it relates to the different needs that are inherent in IEPs and other accommodations, it's very concerning. It makes me think about what's going on right now in terms of how we deliver remote education. So specifically, there are certain states who are grappling, well, I guess all states are grappling with the question of how do we provide equitable educational resources to our students. And unfortunately, I think where we're really falling short is not having that type of research allows us to omit the experiences of some of our special education students. And so as a result, we find ourselves looking, scrambling in this emergency situation, and it is not a good look. Another thing that really stuck out to me is that so many of these studies, they're not really grounded in a theory base. And so it makes me wonder, and please correct me if any of you are, certified in this area. Unfortunately, I can't remember at this time, but I'm not getting a sense of the guiding theories because so many of the pieces did not have that. And I remember being really struck by that as I looked through this piece and wondering what we can do about that in terms of continuing to refine and frame a special education theory base. But again, thank you for a wonderful, well-organized, put together presentation. For folks who have not had a chance to look at it, really, really, really well done. I'm seeing a lot of good comments here, and I hope that that just continues throughout the weekend. Really appreciated the discussion prompts and hope that you will continue to engage your colleagues because they did a really nice job, and hopefully that will be able to allow you to really understand and get a feel for what that lit review looked like. All right, so we will move on now to the discussion area. And I'm going to share a little Blackboard action in just a minute. It looks like I have a couple of new comments here from my last time recording. So we'll start with Letty. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on some of your questions and thoughts. I won't touch on all of them because we are going to put some of those in the PowerPoint going forward, but I did want to honor those. And rather than type, I thought it might be nice to look at it this way. So I will share this screen here. Perfect. All right. So Letty asks us, that Chapter 9's first guideline deals with the need to establish a purpose and voice and indicates that academic writing usually avoids the first person. Is it ever the case where an academic research project incorporates both an objective as well as a first person voice? That is a great question. Generally speaking, when you're writing a dissertation or academic paper, we are rarely using I statements or personal statements, but where there is an exception is generally in qualitative studies around positionality, and also in things like case studies or ethnographies where you're really positioning your relationship to that study. And so in a full immersion, there are times when you would say things such as, I did this, or the researcher did this in their role. It really rarely happens. In your discussion section, however, particularly in qualitative studies, sometimes you will find that the researcher was surprised by certain things, and so you'll see a little less formality there. Those would be those exceptions. And then the second question here, which is, does imperfection refer to an error in the selection of the theoretical model, applying the wrong theoretical framework, or that the theoretical model itself is flawed? So a lot of times it is the latter. It's less about the model being flawed, but often the author's interpretation of the model. And so this is one of those reasons why you really need to dig in the literature and make sure that the ideas that you're aligning yourself with are those that you believe in. Because every time we get an article, you are trusting that someone else did their research, that they checked their receipts. I talk about that all the time. And sometimes folks with an agenda will use a theory in certain ways. And if we're not careful and you're repeating those things and you haven't looked deeply, then you end up with something that's flawed. And so this makes that explanation of the model flawed, if that makes sense. So I'll give you an example. This is why I strongly reject secondary sources, right? Because now you're depending on someone who's had to depend on someone else to explain a theoretical construct or a finding. We need to be as close to the research as possible so that we can understand the context. And for that reason, I'm always trying to link us to the original studies that generate these theories, so then you can make those decisions for yourself. And then some of Letty's thoughts here were that it can help the research author by helping in the maintenance to have a focus, a line of consistency, and overall sense of organization. And this is huge. So all we're doing here, so Galvin and Galvin used the word storyboarding. We've looked at the Post-its, we've looked at the forest to the trees. Your literature review is your map to your proposal. Okay, your intro has told us why it's important. Your background has given us a little bit of information. The literature review is giving us all of that evidence so that we have no choice but to want to learn using your research questions. It's one of the best parts of the process. And so you need absolute focus. The best way to do this is by using these matrices, coming up with outlines so that you make sure that you stay consistent. When we deviate from those things, and we just add one more piece, because you're spending so much time writing, right? When you deviate from that, then it's very, very easy to get distracted and add in these pieces. And then we're just like, oh, this interesting piece is over here. This is over here. And you're getting away from that general message. So consistency is key. And then the final comment I'll touch on here is that writers receive the support and mentoring that help them to develop knowledge and confidence. And I hope that we are doing that here. I want you to leave this class feeling like you can discern some of these articles in a little bit of a stronger way, because we know what we're looking for. It's okay if the articles don't have it, but you are making an informed decision that the article or those findings are important enough that you're able to speak to the limitations within those articles. There are no perfect articles, but there are a lot that are better than some others. All right, thanks so much, Letty. Going back to Galvin and Galvin, Aziz, thank you. So I'll touch on your questions here. The first, would it be better to sequence the arguments from the weakest to the strongest to persuade the reader? So this is a good question. There's answers that are better than others for this. It really depends on your organization. So when you're thinking about topical areas, and for yours, we've talked about the parental engagement piece. It would make a lot of sense to have the strongest argument up top, right? But I would also suggest that you're talking about some of those variables. And so I don't necessarily consider those the weakest arguments. Perhaps they are less cited, but whatever those additional variables of consideration are going to be, we just want to make sure that they're listed. Another piece to remember is that in the doctoral handbook, we're going to be focused on some theory too. And so you've got this theory that houses our big ideas, and then we've got topic, topic, topic. You start out strong, you always want to end strong too. So anywhere we can fit in, someone mentioned it, talking about implications. And so we'll get to that in some of the latter comments here, or the earlier comments. Start strong, but you don't want to end with something that's too light. You want to be able to get to a conclusion that you can tie all together. So remember, think persuasive argument. Big piece here, defend, big piece here, defend, big piece here. So rather than think about the arguments being weakest to strongest, I would think of them as starting out strong, but then within these topic areas, you can go actually from strongest to less studied or something like that. Please do let me know if that answers your question. And then that final question for Aziz here, when using mixed methods, does the section about further research list the limitations of both methods, or will one be sufficient? So that's a great question. Actually, your limitations section is separate from your implications for future research section. So your limitations are going to actually talk about the limitations of both of the multiple methods that are listed within your study. Okay, so if there were threats to reliability and validity, you would stick that in there. If there were threats to, if something was not generalizable, for example, as we know most things aren't, you could put that in there as well. But for your future research, you're going to consider all of those things. But for me, I generally say you're picking 3 to 4 very concrete ideas for someone. Usually one of those is using a method that you didn't use. Another one is using a population that you didn't use. Another one could be to include certain variables that you were either unable or unwilling to consider. And then, something perhaps altogether different that's based on the research that you've created. As for your comments, you mentioned that social science will always need further investigation using different methods and more data, in addition to a larger sample to inject the findings with more doses of reliability and validity. I'm going to skip down a little bit, bearing in mind the location of socioeconomic and other variables of the target population to really focus in on the factors that are contributing to the findings of your research. And that is a fantastic comment. So we've talked about this, forest to the trees, right? Good research is going to introduce these things, and we're going to get into focus so that we can start to understand all of the nuances, the characteristics of everything that is around us. And the only way that we can do that is by capturing more and more data. So great observation there. Thank you, Aziz. All right. Eleftheria provided some really great notes from the Kennedy chapter. And again, if you have anything for Kennedy, you can feel free to simply email me, or also go ahead and drop that in the voice thread. So one thing that came out of the Kennedy notes was Eleftheria had considered the problem of professional development coaches and teachers and professors who really come to the work with absolutely uh, no teaching experience and how that is problematic. And so that idea of what is relatable to a classroom after we come out of these professional development sessions is such a big deal. If folks don't feel that it's relatable, then they aren't going to be able to actively use that. So I really, really appreciated that comment, among others. So for questions, I wonder how helpful engaging memo writing is during this process. So it's actually a great question. I feel that memo writing is very, very important because some are asked questions about why you make the decisions that you do. And memoing helps you remember why you chose certain articles over another, why you went in a certain direction around a conceptual framework, and that really strengthens your argument. So I think it's absolutely important to memo during that time and have that justification. We may not write the justification down very specifically, but if you know it and you believe in it, then it comes through in the writing. And then that second question, are the implications discussed in the literature review the way that we make our argument, and do they introduce the needs of our research? So, somewhat. It really, you're discussing findings, right? And each of these findings technically have implications. So you have an entire implication section at the end of a dissertation that is solely focused on your outcome, your research outcomes, right? But we know that we're able to infer and make assumptions about the implications from previous studies. And so they are used sparingly because again, we're not trying to be predictive, but if you know that a certain audience needs to hear something, so for example, and an example of where you'd use an implication is someone um, when someone says additional research is needed in a specific area, right, to prevent or to promote or do something for a certain audience, if that implication strengthens the need for your research, then absolutely put it in there. If the implication is more predictive, then we don't want to do that as much. And one of your thoughts I want to read aloud. I feel like a detective when searching through databases for articles related to my topic. There's so much literature out there. Having a topic outline can help serve as a roadmap to stay focused. I think that that is amazing advice because it is really, really easy to go through and find something interesting here, something interesting there, and all of a sudden you're looking at the window and you don't even remember what your topic was, or you're thinking about changing your dissertation topic. If you're committed, please don't change it. Some things we just have to have on that personal or hobby reading list, and we have to press pause on that interest. So thank you so much for those contributions. Next up was Anthony. And Anthony, I owe you some more dissertation comments, and I'll be able to get those to you this weekend. A couple of Anthony's questions. How do you find your voice in developing a literature review? Finding your voice in developing a literature review can be quite challenging. The most important thing to do is to remember your purpose and who you want this to speak to. And so for the research that you have been interested in, there's a certain population that you hope to amplify. Like you hope to assist them in perhaps receiving more support services or just being understood and heard in a voice that is unique to their experience. And so you want to make sure that that is coming out. Literature review writing and dissertation writing is all very formal. And so finding your voice is really an art. As long as you stay true to what it is that you want to study, then you'll always find your voice in those findings because you haven't sacrificed those things. And so if you ever feel that this seems inauthentic, that here's what you really want to do, then let's dig deeper and figure out how we can get to the nitty gritty of that. And then your next question, is my information seeking stage effective? it is as effective as you make it. And so if you're easily distracted and you don't set up those organizational pieces, you can actually make the work more difficult for yourself. However, if you are open to um, if you are open to that organization and being able to be more rigid in how you create those ideas, then you'll absolutely be effective and it will be very helpful to you in the long run because you're creating a roadmap. And then some of your thoughts. Making sure to note the strengths and weaknesses of studies, as well as the gaps, relationships, and major trends or patterns that have emerged in the literature. Huge, huge deal. When we don't do that, it feels a little dishonest. I was talking to a student who has done a brilliant job so far, and she's working on her dissertation. She started to talk about all of her studies and how everything just perfectly aligned. And I'm shaking my head, and I get it. I'm feeling her argument, but at the same time, I've noticed not once has she presented a counter argument. And it's simply impossible to be in a situation where every study agrees with all of the findings that you ever find, because we all think differently. And to your earlier point, Anthony, in order to be authentic, you need to make sure that you're able to be critical and recognize what things we need to acknowledge, but don't necessarily fit the scope or the conceptualization of our studies. So really good feedback. Thank you so much. I believe Carrie is next. Yes. All right. So questions from Carrie. When defining terms, create your argument. Can you synthesize multiple defined terms to develop a shared understanding? Or are you supposed to develop original? So the answer is both, as always, right? So I'll give you an example. I do a lot of work on academic integrity. And so one of the things that I've come across is that so many articles define academic integrity in different ways. So I have two choices. I can go with the leading organizations definition, or I can recognize that there's a lot of nuance in these and I can make some decisions. That choice is mine as long as I define it and as long as I am consistent. And so what you do here are two things. You're going to have a definition of terms and you define whatever construct it is very clearly, but you're also going to acknowledge that across the landscape of the research, various authors define in various ways. And you can briefly discuss some of those competing definitions. And then there are small reminders in there, but by and large, we're going to go with your definition that has included all of those things in mind. And then the next question for the future research section of the Lit Review, how many suggestions are appropriate? So I usually am hoping for 3, maybe 4. You don't really need more than that. Is it possible for one suggestion to be better than what you are proposing, and will that affect the way the paper is received? So no, it's quite possible that in this you discover that there was a much better way to do things or something that can produce larger data. The thing is, once your proposal is defended, you've made an agreement to conduct the research in a certain way between you, your chair, and your committee. And so as long as you do that and you use the same rigor that you said that you would use, then that's never going to be in question. What happens is there are always limitations to certain studies and there's always opportunities. We want you to be able to locate those things, even if it could make a robust future study. And hopefully you'll have the chance to actually perform that future study. So for comments, by developing themes in the study matrix, it helps to synthesize the information from multiple papers. Thinking in terms of the argument is helpful and it helps to organize. This is absolutely That's absolutely what I'm hoping for with these organizational tools is if you can do it bit by bit, then you can create a really solid outline. If you create that solid outline, you're pretty much following that from introduction to lit review. And then as you go on to your chapters 4 and 5, you're able to use that same formula so folks feel this ebb and flow that comes with the dissertation and they can stay aligned with the ideas that you're sharing. And then another question about technical voice, where Carrie says, and I'm paraphrasing, that for dissertation and literature reviews that are written less technically, they're easier to read, although sometimes they do need to be technical, and you're thinking about finding your own voice. These are really, really great questions, especially when it comes to education research. Sometimes you'll find things that almost feel a little too comfortable. So personally, I felt that the Kennedy piece kind of got into a bit of storytelling. And for me, it was distracting because I'm looking for statistics, right? And so she's showing these charts and she's giving examples of the professional development interventions. And I'm just like, all right, I appreciate the summary, but I need statistics. It's definitely a balance and it's definitely difficult to do in education. But the important thing is this story easy to read or is this story easily easily in alignment with my topic? If it is, then great. If it isn't, then it just became something that was a little bit more easy to read. And then also thinking about your audience. So you're in a professional education doctorate program. So ideally, at some point, you will want practitioner scholars to be able to read, discern, and move forward with the research that you are embarking on. And so as a result, there's certainly an art to it. We want to have all of our technical language as it relates to certain concepts and constructs because that represents proof of knowledge. That's just the way that the tradition has been set up as far as a dissertation. You'll never write like this again. That said, you want folks to be able to go out and apply this, right? So to LF3's earlier comment, um, you want people to be able to use it in context from individuals who have lived it and have been experts in it based on experience. So you'll find your way. You just want to make sure that you're doing something that feels honest to yourself. All right, and our final comment here is from Sylvia, who happened to be our first, excuse me, our first poster. And she had a quote, which was, "Note the analysis starts with a summary of the original theory and then summarizes the research that supports the theory." I thought that this was a very, very important quote to pick out because you need to make sure that folks know what you're talking about before you start to provide your evidence. And they mentioned it here as it relates to theory, but it also is related to content paragraphs. You need to make sure that what you're trying to share is easily understood and then supported by all of the other articles. If you want folks to understand what you're saying, you need to spell it out early on. And I'm not saying that we need Merriam-Webster definitions, but they need to understand on kind of a basic level so that then they can go, oh, that was an interesting take for this, this, and this. Then those questions, how do individual studies help to define, illustrate, or advance theoretical notions? By anecdotal work or not? So individual studies can help move theory forward because there's always, well, as we saw in Letty, Sylvia, and Myra's presentation, they're not always connected to theory, but we hope that most of them are connected to theory and we can see if there's alignment there. And usually there is some statement within the article that speaks to it. And so you are looking for two things. One, to see if their interpretation of the theory is similar to your own. Two, if the context and the constructs make sense as it relates to your study. And then three, is what they're doing actually in line with the theory, or is it in opposition to the theory? And so you'll see a lot of that in your findings. Rarely is it anecdotal. So you don't want to kind of make those decisions for the research. You'll use your interpretation, but it has to be findings driven, if that makes sense. Please let me know if that was clear, but you want to make sure that any interpretation of the theory is supported by the findings of the individual articles. And then how many studies is reasonable to include in a lit review? So for this class, we're using 8. So we're doing the 4 and 4 with the study matrix. For your lit review, honestly, it's harder to say. I have not counted up how many articles, but I do feel like you know when you're done. What I tell folks is when you get to the literature review portion, we're talking about like paragraphs that summarize these articles, not long paragraphs. I don't want half a page on anything that's not, like a meta-analysis or something like that. We're not talking about large annotations. And so sometimes there can be quite a few pieces that support it. So it's really just case by case. As you get closer to that, I'd be able to answer more, but for this class, we're going to practice with 8. So thank you so much for your comments here. If you haven't had a chance to look at the voice thread and those other pieces, please do that. It is not the same not being able to go back and forth with you in real time, but I'm glad to share this time with you. I hope that you enjoy your weekend. If you have any questions, please do let me know. And again, I will not let this type of delay happen. I'll make sure that we are doing this in advance or finding other ways to record or for me to type out. But I did want to make that connection and acknowledge your comments. I hope you're all doing well and staying safe, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Take good care.